Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to Elizabeth Arnott about The Secret Lives of Murderers' Wives. Welcome, Elizabeth. I love this book cover.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I know, what a cover. I feel so lucky. I had nothing to do with it, obviously, but I love flashing it to everyone. It's
yeah, I love it as well. So to give a little history, Elizabeth is an award-winning author and journalist. She's had articles in the New York Times Review, the Sunday Times, National Geographic, and The Guardian. And she typically, or under, I don't know if it's your real name or your pen name of Lizzie Pook, you write historicals. Now, as Elizabeth Arnott, you've written what I would call modern times, even though it's a mid-60s book. So will you give the audience an overview of what this fabulous book is about?
Sure. So The Secret Lives of Murderers' Wives is a stylish, if I do say so myself, stylish crime thriller set in 1960s California across a long, sweltering summer. It follows Beverly, Elsie, and Margot, who are three unlikely friends who have been joined together by the shared misfortune of having married men who turned out to be serial killers. So they're trying to move on with their lives to deal with the stigma, the shame, the guilt, and build meaningful lives to themselves. But then a string of new murders hits their pretty white picket fence suburb, and the three of them decide to get to work because, after all, who better to catch a killer than those who have shared a life with one?
Yes, I agree. And, I think that when I first got to it, sometimes I remember there was a Long Island serial killer a couple of years ago. And I remember thinking, so he was a bit of a hermit. And the news media talked about how he and his wife were so closed off from the world. And I thought, well, doesn't she notice the man that has blood on him when he comes back from a long night out? But I don't think we humans are always as mistrusting as we think we are. I think a serial killer must lead a double life, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. That is absolutely the case. So, if you speak to experts in serial killers, so criminal psychologists, forensic psychologists, things like that, they will probably tell you that the majority of the time serial killers are, psychopaths or sociopaths, or they are living with some sort of schizoid personality disorder, so split personality disorder. That means they are extremely, extremely adept at compartmentalizing their lives and compartmentalizing their selves. They will see themselves as a totally different person when they're at home with their family, with their kids, their wife, and then the other side of their identity is them in their leisure time, going out and killing. And these people, these serial killers, are so manipulative, and no human, however strong, however intelligent, is immune to being manipulated or lied to or controlled. Nobody. So I do think it's very easy to say, how could she possibly not have known? And I think I had that question going into the writing of this book too. Okay. I think probably a part of me thought, how could these women not have known? I'd have known. I do not. I absolutely do not think that now. And funnily enough, if you do look into real life stories of serial killers' wives, when the penny drops that they are being lied to in some way, the initial thought is, oh, he's having an affair, because of course that is the first sort of deception that we would think of. It's not very immediate to make that stretch to, he's lying to me, oh, he must be out, killing people for kicks.
And I think except for people who marry prisoners knowing that they have been a murderer, I think every other person outside of that one personality would never believe that their partner would kill someone else.
Of course not.
Because you'd be worried to stay with them. You wouldn't close your eyes at night. I wouldn't anyway.
Absolutely. No, I wouldn't. And, funny enough, there's a term for people who marry or are sexually attracted to people who kill, and it's called hybristophilia. And that's when you get those murder groupies. You get people who are just so fascinated by serial killers that they get tattoos. They write to these men. They want to visit them in prison and marry them. And that is a very different thing to my women, Beverly, Elsie, and Margot, who who are normal women who just so happen to end up married to somebody who committed terrible crimes like this.
So I often talk when I'm reading books I have some other friends that are podcasters as well. And sometimes we share the same authors. I had told Elizabeth before we started recording, I watched her episode with Danielle Girard from a couple of weeks ago. It was so wonderful. So occasionally I'll talk to other authors or podcasters about what I'm reading. And I said, I felt like this book was a lot about grief, but not in a depressing way. I mean, here are three women, Beverly, Elsie, and Margot, who have woken up one morning, unfortunately, finding out they're married to a serial killer. And what I think to me is, I think in reading this book, I kept thinking, gee, how would I feel? I am certainly, of the three, I'm Margot in real life. But I don't know. I might become Elsie or I might become Beverly if that had happened to me. So I love the fact that the three women come together and become fast friends, and they also become detectives or sleuths eventually. But how did you craft them so differently, yet they needed to have sort of the same visceral reaction to the new murders?
Yeah. And so I suppose their similarity is their resilience. They have each of them been through this hideous thing, yet they can still laugh. They can still drink a cocktail by the pool, and if you're Margot, you're going to go out to a party in faux fur and sequins, But I did want them to be representative of the many different ways in which, you or I might respond to the knowledge that the person that we married and loved was a serial killer. I wanted them to show that there is no one way to be a victim. There is no one sort of victim. There is no one right way in which to process and deal with and move on from trauma. So I did want them, I wanted readers to be able to look at these women and perhaps not wholesale say Margot's me, but to say, oh, I recognize myself in the way that she's reacted to this one thing,
right,
or the armor that she's wearing in this situation, or I recognize myself in how Elsie has to arm herself with facts. She now has a constant search for the truth and interrogation into the truth of every single situation. She works in a newsroom. She's an assistant to the editor, but she wants to be a reporter because her life now is seeking facts, because she just, is trying to move on from the fact that she was bested by someone. And I think that is something that all the women share. Beverly, it deals with perhaps more guilt than the other two, shoulders a lot of blame for what her husband did. She's got 2 young children, which probably has a lot to do with it. But they're all trying to move on. They're all trying to build meaningful lives, as I said. And I think their friendship works so well because, yes, they are very different. But I think with friendship, and probably female friendship in particular, we are so often bonded by the worst thing that has happened to us. And, friendship in many cases can be survival and, necessary for survival. And it's been that way for, tens of thousands of years. So it was really fun to write their friendship because, as you say, yes, this is a book about murder, but it's can be quite funny in parts. It is lighthearted in parts because they're women, and women are funny, and women are powerful and strong. And no, they're not just going to sit around and mope. They're going to catch this, bastard who's, come into their suburb.
Into their orbit almost, I think, so that was one of the things I loved, is because I live here in Southern California, and I can tell any listener that when we have an Indian summer here, it's particularly difficult because we have a very hot summer because it's a desert climate. And then when we get to that thought of, oh, it's autumn now, and then summer sneaks back in, it's particularly brutal. And I mean, I could feel that you captured that so well. And the fact that it's the 60s, I mean, they couldn't have a bank account or a credit card unless a man signed for them. So here are three women that have been done wrong on so many levels just because they're women is already a hindrance in their lives. And then, of course, to have been unfortunately married to a serial killer. But then you do what's so beautiful is you give them each so many strengths to rely on, and you give them a great friendship. Are you fortunate to have close girlfriends? Hopefully you weren't married to a serial killer. Sorry.
No.
Okay.
They say write what you know, but
right. Hopefully not.
Yeah, I've got a really strong network of female and male friends. Actually, I've also got an identical twin sister, which is a different, a whole nother level.
Yes.
A whole nother level of friendship. But yeah, I think I think. Yeah, friendship can see us through just the most impossible and most difficult of things. But it's interesting that you said about the women not being able to have a credit card or bank account, and that I very specifically set it in the 60s because I wanted my women to be as you said, be in the difficult situation of having had these men as a husband, but be in an even another difficult situation of being a woman in the 60s.
Precisely.
I was really interested to read that in many states in the 60s, women weren't allowed to serve on juries because it was thought that they were too fragile and too sensitive, and they would be too compassionate, and couldn't be objective enough to get justice, and it would take them away from the heart of the home. And I thought, well, that's such rubbish. I'm going to make my women solve a murder.
Well, and I'm glad because
cops can't do it.
Yeah, well, and women, in my estimation, are the stronger sex in a lot of different ways, but especially in emotional. If I had to have a child, if children were up to men, the world's population would cease to exist because none of us are strong enough for that. So it's like, but that's one of the great things is I love Elsie's thirst for knowledge because I'm a researcher. I like to dig and I like to know things, and I love that. And I was so disappointed in Elsie's struggles at work, never being seen. She gets invited into the boardroom one day and only to be sent out for a bottle of scotch because her boss has a meeting later on with a friend of his. And it's like, wow, and it was just, but at no time did I felt sorry for Elsie's situation, but she was still a strong character with a great mind. And I love the fact that you imbued all three of them with good minds.
Thank you. Yeah, that was really important to me. And I think another reason why I set it particularly then was that this was the mid to late 60s. Serial killer activity was really just starting to really boom. You would get into the 70s where it just, it exploded, 70s to the late 80s. But the FBI's behavioral science unit wasn't yet set up. And that was the team that started profiling serial killers and catching them that way.
Sure.
And so I wanted to put my three women with, very powerful minds in a situation where they were beating the FBI's behavioral science, unit to the, beating them to the chase, doing something that we know that predominantly men did, a little bit later on. So it was really important to me that they were authentic characters in what they had gone through, but also having read lots of accounts of real life serial killers' wives and seen just how much power was taken away from them and how much autonomy and agency was taken away from them. I wanted to put that back in with my characters, and that's why they're so very, they're propulsive. There's lots of action there. They really want to solve these crimes.
Well, and I think that would be normal. I think that would be a very normal reaction, you know. And one of the things that I also think could have been a normal reaction is someone who just sinks into themselves and somebody has to rush in and take care of them. And that is not these women, even though I'm not going to spoil anything, but that type of thing does affect one of the characters in the long run. And then you give us lots of red herrings along the way. I mean, the women think, oh, it must be this one or it must be that one, which I think that, you know, if you wake up one morning and you find out your husband was a serial killer, do you trust anyone?
Well, exactly.
I mean, I don't know that I would trust anyone, because you think, well, that person's looking at me funny. And then, of course, they have the shame of being survivors. You know, they are not they're a victim, but they're not dead. They're a survivor. And survivors, I think, often have it worse because they have to deal with their own guilt, their own grief, their own loneliness. And why didn't I know? Because I think that's the thing that we're so often left with is, I should have known. I should have seen something. But when you have a master manipulator as a spouse, you don't see things.
Exactly. And I think with the women, they are victims, but they feel like they haven't earned the right to call themselves that in a way. And I think that's possibly the case with you know, women in this who have experienced this in their real lives. It's not uncommon for them just to completely disappear and want to disappear, and that is absolutely a valid, you know, response to this. Very often you see them change their name, change their children's surnames, move state, seal financial records, seal everything, and just try and move on that way, because they are victims, but they are not necessarily looked upon as that by the rest of society. And that's something that I really hope, you know, that's the perception that I really hope to challenge with this novel, because I certainly learned a great deal of empathy, and, you know, ended up at the end of this novel with feeling like I had so much compassion and love and respect for these women. And I extend those thoughts to people who, you know, the real life women who found themselves in this situation too, because it's such a difficult situation. You have suffered so much, yet you don't feel like you have the right to say that you have, because you're still here. So survivor's guilt. Yeah, absolutely.
Of course. You know, and I think the survivor's guilt is the thing that I would think would be the hardest thing, because, you know, you think, well, why did my husband kill so-and-so and not kill me?
Yeah.
You know, and I think that is something that can be very debilitating.
Yeah.
I hope never to find out. I've read stuff, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And, you know, also, I think for the victims of the husbands, they're often overlooked by the news media, even in today's world, because it's all about the perpetrator. So that's the person who gets all the glory, all the lauding in the news, but not necessarily the victims. The victims are, you know, they, number one, number two, number three, they may have some hair color, eye color, body shape, or whatever, but they're mostly forgotten.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case, and that remains the case today. You know, it's people like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, Dennis Rader. You know, they when they committed their crimes were emblazoned across the front of newspapers. Even now, you can buy Ted Bundy T-shirts, Ted Bundy pin badges, posters, mouse mats, like whatever you want. But most of us can't name a single one of his victims, and there were 30 of them. You know, and in a way, it's you know, it's murderers sell newspapers. That's why editors put them on the front of newspapers.
That's right. That's right.
Rather than the victims. But, you know, you do need victims if you want to tell that story. So it's
right.
Really difficult. And I've spoken to people, you know, lots of people in the true crime space, and women who are sort of campaigning to put victim first shows on the TV and stuff like that, and they really struggle with, commissioners are just like, no, people want the flashy serial killers. We are so naturally drawn to that as humans, unfortunately, but it does mean that the people whose lives has been taken are just completely overlooked. So that is why I did want to flip the perspective somewhat, place these women, but also put a bit more focus on the victims of the killer in this story too. So we do learn a little bit about them, and the men, the women's husbands, and the perpetrator of these crimes going on is sort of shifted into the back a bit more. So that was my attempt at trying to sort of redress the balance, but it's a constant battle. It's always going to be that case. We are fascinated by serial killers and people who commit these sorts of crimes. It's our nature as human beings.
It is our nature. I think also that we hope that we never encounter one, whether being a victim or just knowing one. So I think that is an understandable preoccupation in my mind, because it's so foreign and so removed. A friend of mine's husband tried to unalive her years ago, and I said to her, unfortunately, I love you, but I don't know what that's like. I don't know what your experience is like. If I make a mistake, you have to let me know, because I didn't know. We don't know serial killers. We may know one, but don't know that they're a serial killer. Yeah. It is not something that we are likely to encounter in our lives if we're lucky. So,
and now, that's the thing. Sorry, I was just going to say. Nope. It's, some people can say, oh, how do you know if someone's a serial killer? Well, you don't. That's why they get away with being serial killers. You don't get away with murdering multiple people across an extended period of time by waving a flag, saying, I'm a bad man, Yeah. Everybody's susceptible to being conned by these people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So from watching you on another show, I realized this book took very little time to write, your first draft. Will you tell the audience how long?
Wow. I mean, I sort of hate myself for this. Because
no, please don't, Elizabeth.
Because it hasn't happened before, and it won't happen again.
It might.
But it was big. So the first draft of it took me 6 weeks. But it was under very particular circumstances. I'd gone through something very difficult in my personal life. I was grieving a very painful loss, and needed something to cling to. And I was out of contract. Nobody had asked for this book. I hadn't told my agent I was writing it, hadn't run the idea past her or anything. But as I meant, these three women, it was almost like they popped up behind my laptop and were like, okay, we see you. We see there's something going on here. Let's go. And so, yes, that first draft was kind of a quick frenzy of getting everything down on paper. Obviously, in the edits and things, that was a much, much longer process.
Yeah. It took a little longer than 6 weeks on that.
Yeah.
But it's all right. It's all right.
But yeah, I mean, it was just one of those. It was just one of those things that probably, as I said, will never happen again in my creative life. But it was an energizing experience, and it really, it helped me put one foot in front of the other again and keep going. And at the end, I had this book, and I had to tell my agent that I'd written something that was very different to my previous historical fiction, and didn't know what she was going to think. But thankfully, it went well.
Well, it did. And, I love inspired stories. This was definitely inspired. I think the muse bites us when it bites us. I had a character this morning tell me where he was having breakfast. I'm like, okay, can I go back to sleep now? I got you. I know exactly where he had breakfast now. I've sat at the same counter in my life, but I did not need to be awakened to be told where he was going to have breakfast. I'm like, okay, fine. Did you make mine too? But, but I think though that writing can be such a catharsis event, and I'm glad it has helped with you, because the result is The Secret Lives of Murderers' Wives, and it is by Elizabeth Arnott. It is so delicious, so wonderfully done, Elizabeth. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. It was really lovely to chat to you.
It was lovely chatting with you. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.